The war against the miners was clearly more than that. It was a class war, and the sections of the working class who were under attack were all sections. And if you think about those times, the preceding the miners' strike, you'd had massive urban riots, which were then repeated in cities and towns around the country during the miners' strike itself in 1985. For example, Tottenham in Liverpool. You had Broadwater Farm and the bringing of Northern Ireland policing onto the streets of the mainland for the first time. You had criminal fraternities such as the Metropolitan Police, who clearly played a key part in defeating the miners, or should I say, being that strong arm of the state, notoriously so. The Metropolitan Police were also deployed in Tottenham and were deployed around the country. And we know, looking back now, that Metropolitan Police were involved in all sorts of stuff which is beginning to come out around the Stephen Lawrence scandal, or what's been known for a long time, but what's beginning to be revealed around the depths of corruption and racism in the Metropolitan Police. So we felt that this was an important session to try and bring together those struggles which were happening simultaneously and feeding in one to the other. I'm sure if Darkus was here today, he'd be talking about the Brixton Miners Solidarity group and how much solidarity was delivered from Brixton to the miners in the north of England and so on and so forth. In other words, and if you read Darkus's work and work of other radical black activists at the time, men and women, you'll know how important the miners were to them. They saw them, in one sense, it was a battle being fought on different fronts. So that's really the context of this particular session today. And I'm going to ask Henry to start first, and then Weymann will contribute, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So Henry, over to you.
All right, well, first of all, just to disabuse you, I'm no substitute for Darkus Howe, who would frankly have given you a much more edifying talk. And I'm also, I can tell you now, this is all a bit impromptu really, but because I haven't really discussed with Hassan exactly what I'm going to say, but I've got a few themes, I think, that I'd like to bring out. And it really concentrates on the difference between policing in the 1980s, particularly around the miners' strike and the riots, and what's going on at the moment, the current debate about policing, and what I think is the really interesting development of the relationship between government and the police, which has really come to a head in the last week with the publication of the Ellison Review. But I'm going to start by just with an anecdote, really, which is a story of my own experience and involvement in defending in the miners' strike. 1984, the first time that the police used the charge of riot against miners was in relation to a fairly minor incident which happened in a car park after a march in Mansfield. There was a little bit of a fracas, a few little missiles got thrown here and there, and a whole lot of people got arrested. In fact, 55 people got arrested, and they charged them all with riot for the first time. People think, in fact, that it was at Orgreave that it was the first time that riot was used in the miners' strike, but it wasn't. And in those days, riot was what's known to us lawyers as a common law offence, which meant that it had unlimited punishment. You could get, theoretically, life imprisonment if you were guilty of riot. About a year later, they enacted the Public Order Act of 1986 and put it on a more, regulated footing. But it was that the decision to charge riot was a political decision, and it was taken for one reason only, which was to intimidate miners. Before that, people had been charged with sort of relatively minor public order offences. And in the normal course of events, that's what you would have expected to happen in the Mansfield case. Well, the trial itself came on about a year later. We made what now seems like a completely a bizarre application for all 55 people to be tried together, sort of Turkish-style political trial, which was understandably rejected by the judge, and in retrospect, it seems like a completely mad application to have made, but we did it because that was the thing to do. But they broke it down into the first trial, which was of 18 people, and there was a combination of minors, many of them I seem to remember from, there were Notts minors actually, there were striking Notts minors. And there were a few sort of waifs and strays. One of those was my client. He happened to be a member of the Kilburn SWP who'd gone on he was on the Solidarity demonstration. And Adrian, my client, had taken the rather unusual step of answering all questions in interview, which included a complete confession to kicking a police officer while he was lying on the ground. So I had a bit of a hard task. He was charged with, on the one hand, riot, and if that wasn't good enough, a fray as an alternative, and he was then charged with causing actual bodily harm to PC Smith, let's call him, I can't remember his name. And Adrian didn't really play much part in the trial. I mean, he did turn up. Sometimes we found out from the jury afterwards they were very worried about him. They weren't quite sure what sort of state he was going to be every Monday morning, but he did manage to turn up. Occasionally he would pass me notes which had absolutely nothing to do with what was happening during the course of the trial. But there was the best note was this. When they finally called PC Smith to give evidence, he had a note, and I was passed down from the back, passed forward to counsel's bench, and I opened it up, and it just said, "It's not him." So I suddenly found myself running some sort of mistaken identity defence. And sure enough, it's right. It wasn't PC Smith. The person that he'd assaulted was somebody else, completely different. Anyway, the trial took about 3 months. The jury were out for 10 minutes. We later found out they debated just how long they should stay out and acquitted everybody, including Adrian, who'd pleaded guilty. So that was my experience. The Orgreave trial, in which I wasn't involved, I was hoping that there was going to be somebody here from the Orgreave campaign because it's come very much back into public focus as a result of the Hillsborough inquiry and the Hillsborough inquest, which is about to start. And of course, the Orgreave case was a tale, as we now know, and is already more or less accepted, of the mass industrial scale fabrication of evidence. And there are plainly links between what was happening at Hillsborough and what happened during the Orgreave case. I mean, the thing that we need to remember about it, I think, just to move on to, if you like, the lessons of the time, is that if you remember, at the time, the police were used as a very crude political weapon. If you remember, those of you, and there are people here who do remember it, the cops used to wear a badge which had the letters ASPMM, which stood for Arthur Scargill Pays My Mortgage. And there was a huge amount of money that was made by cops doing overtime duty. They were known not just to the strikers, but more widely, as Maggie's boot boys. And they were used, as Hassan has said, really like an army, and Orgreave was a very good example of it. I mean, some people here may know more about than I do, but from what I do know about Orgreave, I mean, Orgreave was a classic setup. They got the miners into a particular area. There was the usual sort of confrontation, which very often took place in those sorts of events, and then suddenly, out of the blue, the front line of cops opened, and the cavalry went in, and people were very badly injured. There are people who still bear the psychological scars of that day. They then tried them all for riot, which was a terrifying experience because they were all at risk of long prison sentences. And the point is that the police were used in a very crude, very overt political way, if you like. Now, I'm going to move, if I can. I want to come back to talk a little bit more about policing, but I want to move, if I can, straight away, just to consider the current situation, because the review published by Mark Ellison last week is a very important moment. Well, in fact, the original Stephen Lawrence inquiry was a very important moment. But what has any of you who've read the papers in the last week and been watching the news coverage will realise is that what has now been accepted, more or less accepted to have happened, is that there was a deliberate policy of concealment by the Metropolitan Police of very important material from the Macpherson inquiry into Stephen Lawrence. And that is all tied up to an extraordinary period, but maybe it's not extraordinary, but an interesting period of widespread police corruption during it was very bad in the mid-1970s. It continued pretty bad into the 1980s, and there was a there was this almost symbiotic relationship between organised crime and really quite senior policing. A very good book on the subject, which I can recommend, is a book called Untouchables, written by Michael Gillard and Laurie Flynn. Mm-hmm. Some of you here will remember Laurie Flynn. Used to be a journalist on Socialist Worker many years ago, went on to work for Granada, and a fine investigative journalist. And that tells the story, the extraordinary story of police corruption in the 1980s and the 1970s actually, through to the 1980s and into the 1990s. And there were various attempts to sort of, for the cops to clean up their act, but they almost all failed. But it culminated in an investigation which was called Operation Athona, which was supervised, I think, by Paul Condon, who was then the Met Police Commissioner. I may have got that wrong, but I think that's right. And the most extraordinary revelation that comes out from the Ellison Review is that there was, not only did they not manage to get access to the Athona material, but it turns out that the Athona material was, in the early 2000s, the inquiry having taken place in the early 1990s, systematically shredded. Now, I've just recently been doing a case involving an ancient miscarriage of justice, a man who was convicted of murder in 1976, at a time when a number of the officers were suspected of being involved in one level of corruption. There was a man in that case called Ray Adams.
Yes.
Read the Ellison Review, because his name features. We lost our case. We got judgment in January, but what was recorded in the judgment was that Adams, who we were focusing on in our appeal, had actually lied to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Not, in fact, if you read the Ellison Review, Adams comes out with a completely clean bill of health. So, although Ellison has made the conclusions of Ellison are very important, it has possibly only scratched the surface. I mean, somebody described Neil Davison to me, who's the officer who's really at the centre of the Davison of the Ellison report, as low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's the more senior officers and the involvement of the more senior officers that's of greater interest. And of course, we'll never know now exactly what Athona concluded, because the conclusions of Athona were kept very secret, and now we find out that they've shredded most of the material. But moving on to the political point, what is interesting is the way that this has been dealt with by the Tories. Now, is it just a case that at root Theresa May is an upstanding person who believes in the rule of law and is committed to rectifying injustice, because she was absolutely clear about the implications of Ellison? Or is there something else that lies behind it? Now, I don't want to get into a conspiracy theory, because the Ellison Review was actually ordered in the wake of the successful prosecutions of Norris and Dobson, and Mark Ellison had in fact prosecuted them, and so he was asked to carry out this review into whether or not material had been withheld from the Macpherson inquiry, and also the Guardian had obviously had this story about the officer who'd been sent to spy on the Lawrence family, so he had to look at those things. But Theresa May's enthusiasm for the Ellison report is interesting. And why are the Tories so enthusiastic about it? Well, the answer is Plebgate. And why did Plebgate happen? Why did the cops fabricate a case against the obnoxious Andrew Mitchell? Because they did. It's pretty clear to anybody who's looked at it. Why did they do it? Well, the answer, of course, is to be found in the badges that were being worn by the police Fed members when they were at their demonstrations in the immediate aftermath of that. You remember they had, I can't remember what it said now, but they had a badge, they were all plebs or something like that. What it's to do with is the cuts. The cops have been cut by something like 20%. I mean, this is Osborne's scorched earth policy. They are so ideologically committed to their economic strategy that in a sense they don't really care who gets in the way. But it's created a problem for them. I mean, Theresa May was given a most horrendously hard time at the next Police Fed conference. And so what they need to do is to discipline the cops. I mean, Plebgate, I mean, the aftermath of Plebgate, and in fact Lawrence, it gives the Tories the high moral ground, and that is a way of saying to the cops, you're still going to have to be on our side, but we're not going to give you the money, all right? And that, I think, is the dynamic that's happening now. And it's very different, isn't it? Because if you think about that in contrast to what was happening in the 1980s, where, to repeat a point I made, the police effectively were being used as Maggie's army. There was absolutely unstilting loyalty. There wouldn't have been a word of criticism of any police officer voiced by the Thatcher regime. Things have moved on, and they've had to shift their position. So that's the sort of whether I'm right or wrong, that is the main political point I wanted to make, my main take on it. But I just want to just say something else, which is less important, but I think is just worth thinking about in terms of the policing of demonstrations since the miners' strike, what has happened since then, and the continuing dangers. Starting really at more recent times, one thing that Ellison doesn't criticise is the fact that there was something called the Special Demonstration Squad. I mean, he appears to accept that was that undercover policing is entirely necessary, and undercover policing in the form of something called the Special Demonstration Squad is something which is neither is not only unobjectionable, it's actually something which should be supported. Well, just a minute. I mean, we do live, do we not, comrades, in a democracy. Why is there a need for there to be a special secret police unit which is set up just to police people who are involved in entirely legitimate political protest? Because that's what they did. In a sense, we've always imagined that there was such a thing in existence, but it's interesting to have it confirmed. And of course, not only to have it confirmed, but to have the full extent of the revelations about what the Special Demonstration Squad has been up to revealed. I mean, I have to say, I don't know about you, but I find the revelations about the activities of the likes of Mark Kennedy as profoundly shocking as anything that happened during the course of the miners' strike. I mean, they were involved in systematic deception of people. A number of them fathered children, and what happened has quite rightly been described, in my opinion, as rape because they deceived people into having relationships. I don't know if you saw Newsnight last week. They had an interview with a teacher who'd been effectively the victim, because the only way to describe her, of some guy who'd been working undercover, and she later found out that after he went from her bed straight home to his wife's bed without blinking an eye, and that is really I think that's probably as bad as the as what happened to the miners' strike. And what happened to the miners' strike was cruder, but it was quite frightening. But the final point I want to make before handing over is really about the policing of demonstrations since. Firstly, it is quite interesting that despite the sort of the general notion, if you like, that things tend to improve, the sentencing for public order offences has incrementally increased over the years. The Shrewsbury Pickets case in the early 1970s, which still rumbles on as a sort of major miscarriage of justice, involved, you remember Ricky Tomlinson, the ex-building worker turned actor. They were sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. Des Warren, who served every day of his 3 years because he wouldn't conform while he was in custody, they received 3 years sentences. On similar facts today, they'd get upwards of 6 years, in my opinion. That's what you'd be looking at. In the 1980s, if you hadn't been arrested on the day, you were probably safe. What has happened since, of course, is that police investigations are based principally on CCTV. I mean, the watershed moment, actually, was the Trafalgar Square poll tax riot. I represented a handful of people, and it was tragic, actually. I mean, it was the classic sort of, knock on the door in the early hours of the morning. Prosecutions which were based upon on film. I mean, police film, as it happens in Trafalgar Square. But nowadays, of course, a lot of prosecutions are based on CCTV evidence. And so everybody now knows that whenever you go to a protest, if you have found yourself sort of caught up in something, but nothing has happened on the day, that's not necessarily the end of it. And I think that has had a very corrosive effect. I mean, they put a lot of work into these post-incident investigations. Welling was another good example, which a number of people here will be familiar with. So, although when we look back on the miners' strike, I think we can say, well, look, I mean, some people might say, the Tories would like to say, because they're fully behind the Hillsborough investigation, these were the bad old days, things have changed. Actually, firstly, they haven't changed. Secondly, in a way, it's more sinister. I don't want to put the fear of God into you, but I think it's important to recognise that technology is now used in a much more sinister way. One final point, sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I've always got another final point to make before somebody else takes over. This is completely random, okay, and whether I'm off message or not, I don't know. I'd just like to say something very briefly about the Mark Duggan case and in that context, jury trials. The family of Mark Duggan are quite rightly absolutely outraged at the decision, and it may be actually that it's successfully judicially reviewed, I don't know. But we always need to remember when something like that happens that lying in the wings are suggestions that it's all the fault of juries and that all you need to do is to get rid of jury trial. I had the misfortune on Monday night to attend a meeting which was organised by the charity Justice, which the main speaker was our current Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas, who's a complete buffoon. But it was quite worrying, really, because it became clear that the message that he wanted to give was how we manage justice in the age of austerity. Because, as you all know, yesterday, my comrades were all on strike, including me, because one of the biggest threats to justice at the moment is the cuts. You know, people just, I'm glad to say, quite extraordinarily, you know, we've a very conservative profession that's actually sort of, you know, really on the move, and we may possibly be able to halt them in their tracks. But that's the issue for us, and I can tell you, the sort of lawyers who would do, yes, I'm almost there, the sort of lawyers who would do the type of work that, you know, that we would want them to do are going to find it difficult to stay in business. I mean, the Bernburg Pierces of this world are going to really struggle. So I then hear the Lord Chief Justice saying, well, justice in the age of austerity. What's one of his main proposals? He goes back to an idea which has been floated from time to time: limit the right to trial by jury. You know, get rid of the right to trial by jury for more minor offences. Nowadays, of course, if you that's your main safeguard against wrongful conviction is the right to trial by jury. So that's another unwelcome development.
Thanks, Henry. You touched on a lot of points with a good historical sweep, and on the one hand, I take your point about what Theresa May is trying to discipline the police. I'm sure that's absolutely true, but I think with the Ellinson report, which I have read, it's uncovered such a can of worms that in actual fact it might actually escape her control in terms of actually how deep it goes, because what it begins to map out is that the South East London police were a criminal conspiracy and the Lawrences were caught up in the middle of it, and it's to do with mass importation of drugs, reselling of drugs by police out the back door, killings, including killing of that solicitor, the Brinks robbery. It goes on and on and on. So she may well have opened a real can there. The other thing which did spring to mind when you were talking about how ordinary people try and seek justice, we have to remember that it's so contradictory, because in the Lawrence case, it was the inquest jury who delivered the verdict of unlawful killing on Stephen Lawrence, and then virtually named the 5 boys who were the chief suspects, that actually pushed the police into actually doing something, and the Daily Mail putting their pictures on the front of the newspaper. So it was actually the inquest jury that, if you like, struck a significant blow in terms of Lawrence's. But then, of course, the Macpherson report then went on to recommend the abolition of double jeopardy, where you could be tried twice for the same crime. And of course, that's on the basis of which Norris and Dobson were then convicted. So it's very contradictory in terms of how ordinary people can try and seek redress when the odds are stacked against them. It's an unfortunate thing. I'm very glad to be able to welcome Weymann Bennett. Weymann, over to you.
All right. Thanks very much. I want to thank Henry and his team, mainly for keeping me out of jail, by the way, and Matt and Pete from Bernbridge Piers, because I've been arrested 33 times, and each time I've been arrested and they've brought in Bernbridge Piers to come up and said that they were going to defend me. They've also said who was your barrister? They said Henry and various other people, and the police would sit down and usually they'd let me go, except for a few occasions. Anybody who tells you it doesn't matter who you're represented by and whatever it is, it's just absolutely not the case. It's part of the reason why when you campaign you have to have those people behind. But what I want to start off from is to talk a little bit about what was going on at the miners' strike, because it was a pivotal changing point personally in my life and the way that I felt about the struggle at the time. At that time, I would say if you were in a black community, you felt like the police were, they could do what they liked. I mean, they had things like police nigger hunt. And I remember growing up in Stratford thinking it was normal. If you went out, they'd just stop you everywhere. They still do, but they would stop you much more violently. It'd be a punch in the gut, a slap round the face. You know what they used to call a clip round the ear, and it was constant. It was never stopping. And actually, the rot went all the way to the top. People might not know. People might not have heard of the Mangrove 9, or have heard of. But people have to remember where Paul Condon came from. Paul Condon came out of Notting Hill. That's where he's training from. And if you listen to the SPG and the training that went into the miners' strike, and they said, what were the manuals? When you read the manuals came out of 1976, the riots that took place after Notting Hill, about how they were going to apply to the enemy within. The early enemy within, they considered to be the new migrants that arrived, and they used that model all the way through. And that's part of the reason. What was really interesting in the miners' strike was, if you were in a black community, actually, to a certain extent, used to go around, and there was almost a certain idea of diction of Doc Green. If you said, I remember the Scarman report, a complete corrupt officer getting up and saying, "Are you questioning my honesty?" Right? That was his answer. He didn't have to say anything else. "Are you questioning my integrity?" Right? I don't think you get away with that today, simply saying that. And at that time, it was the idea that you could actually you could pick on people. But one of the turning points I think took place in the miners' strike were a series of riots that took place in between 1984 and 85. All over, in Handsworth and various other places, there were riots. And the riots were important because, I think there was a debate about what were the police doing at that time, because they saw their role of keeping the Queen's peace, and it's a big peace. So, in that sense, it was about making sure that the people they saw as threats, as working class people, anybody that challenged them. One of the things that happened during that took place, I remember being part of a campaign with Winston Silcott, Ergin, a group of people, a group of people been arrested, and we went round the country asking for solidarity and support. And I went with a man called Michael Logan, who was from Broadwater Farm, up to the mining villages. My brother was studying at York University. I remember I didn't want to go because I thought the idea of going to this area, which was actually, to be honest, 99% white, and it was a murder of a white policeman, I thought we were going to get treated terribly when you went to the thing. And people came in. I remember this guy saying, were you involved in that riot? Did you support what was going on? And the whole place gave us a standing ovation. And I just thought, there's not going to be any trouble here. And the reason why that's important was because the experience of what was happening to lots of black communities was being experienced by the way that the police were behaving in those areas. It wasn't, the idea that they just used judicial. They were using non-judicial activity, and they were arresting people. And I think really what came out, there was a lot of arguments came out of that time. Actually, the late Stuart Hall, I remember going to the debates that took place about how did we become a police state? That was what happened, authoritarian popularism. Actually, to a certain extent, I don't agree with those ideas. Even where I grew up, the police were never popular. Do you know what I mean? In those communities in East London, it's not true. There was this kind of, they're dishonest, but they're good, right? I was like, never trust a copper. That's the first thing that came out of the Dockers area, and that's the first thing I was told. I remember Docker saying, when you look at you go out the Old Bailey, he goes, where do the eyes look to? And they said, the eyes look to the west. And he went, where do the arse look to? And he goes, look to the east, mate. And he goes, that's us, right? Because you cannot trust the judicial system in the way that it works. And that was, in some sense, a certain sense of, in terms of what's happening about the question of class power. But I want to touch on a couple of things about which Henry talked about now, about what's been exposed. You see, Haz was instrumental in this in terms of the stuff. During the Stephen Lawrence report, we were part of a campaign that supported Doreen in her campaign. And I remember speaking in one of the meetings with lots of other people, and we put up the argument that the police were rotten and corrupt. And at the time it was a soft argument. Maybe they were all dealing it together. To be honest, we were totally wrong. They were much worse than that. That's the truth. Much worse than we could have ever imagined. They were sitting in the room recording what we were saying. Right? Actually, that was the truth of it. And it went through Brian Douglas. Every campaign that we went through, there was a police officer sitting there. I can't wait until this comes out, because I'm convinced, and many of the times the police would attack the pickets and things that we held. I think they were organised and planned by this group, and that something has to be done about it, and that has to be exposed. And I want to talk something about Welling, because the late Julie Waterson and the late Paul Foote, I remember discussing it with them. And actually, I don't agree with conspiracy theories, but I do believe there was a conspiracy around Welling. To this day, I think it was a planned attack on anti-racists that were trying to close down the BNP headquarters. And it's not just an accident. Every single time you confront the fascists, there's a problem in which the police somehow align with those people who are carrying out the attacks. And the reason why I say this is because they always said that we were planning on doing things. The evidence could have only come from SDS officers. I remember when I was charged with conspiracy to commit violent disorder, there was evidence, they said, that we planned to smash the windows of coaches. That was what was on my charge sheet. I remember Matt reading it to me. And actually, later on, it turns out there was an undercover officer who'd said he'd heard plans to to smash the windows of Nazi coaches. Right? I'm not against smashing. So I'll be careful what I say. I've been filmed. Right? I'm not against doing that in a certain general sense. They've got no right to be there and intimidate communities, Muslim communities, whatever. They've got no right to do that. But what I am saying is that was a basis for the arrest of all the people in Bolton, that they were planning on doing that. And actually, I think they broke into people's houses. They smashed up their houses. Now, this isn't back in the old days. This is 3 years ago. Right? The police, we're told, have changed. And the same people that were involved in that, I believe, have carried out the same policies long after it was disbanded. And the other thing that's got to be said, I have to say this, we raised the question after the Macpherson inquiry, when the thing came up about the Dobsons, Doreen went to see David Blunkett about this very same question. And I remember the door being shut. I remember saying, what's going on? And all the doors, and I was told this, we don't want to ever hear anything more about Stephen Lawrence inside the Home Office anymore. So I accept the question the Tories might be opening over Plebgate, but some people must have seen those reports about what the police were doing, and I named them, Jack Straw and David Blunkett must have seen them, and they decided to stay quiet. And that's the truth. I think this scandal goes much deeper, because at some point somebody's going to have to be held responsible. Why did they keep it quiet? Why didn't they put those whole reports and make sure that everybody knew what was happening? Because what they've done, in some senses, is not doing. The truth is that Paul Gondon should have been sacked. Sir Paul Condon should be stripped of his knighthood, whatever it is, because who ordered those people to do that? Who gave them the bottle of whiskey? So, you know, I think that out of this, we're going to have to campaign about this. If it's true that people have to be held account for what they've done, then those people have to be held for account for what they've done in that sense. It's true, who let the murderers get away with it for so many years? I believe that the truth is that the police are not just institutionally racist, they're absolutely institutional corrupt as well. I remember Has writing an article about Officer Coles meeting someone at a petrol station and being handed a brown paper bag. And it was a squarish kind of paper bag. It doesn't take very much to guess what's in it. Yeah? And he couldn't give an account for what he was doing. They said they demoted him at the time. They knew all about this corruption all the way through. In fact, I remember when the late Paul Foot asked me to write an article about the beginning of the Macpherson report, and I heard that Macpherson was going to be put in charge of the report. He was the most racist judge you've ever heard. Every trial he'd come up against, and the young black, I remember there was a statement about he's sick and tired of West Indians pulling out knives like teaspoons. I just thought this trial isn't going to. He was so shocked by the rubbish that came out inside the Macpherson thing, he turned, and he actually used radical statements saying the police were institutionally racist. And I think really what was the watershed about the miners' strike? It actually broke the whole idea that the police say the truth. Lots of northern towns now, if you say to people that the police beat people up without any kind of reason, people accepted it, and that was something that went through. That's something that went through all kinds of different communities. The reason why it's important now is because when we demonstrated against the fascists now, as a member, there are now mass arrests of people. They arrest 100, they arrest 300 people. And when you say, what have you been arrested for? They say it's a catch-all phrase. And I don't believe in just conspiracy theories and that you can't change things, because after all, they had to lock up Tommy Robinson, didn't they? The truth of it is, they tried to lock us up, but they had to end up locking him up. Why was that? That was because communities, working class communities, black and white, Muslim and non-Muslim, came together right up in Tower Hamlets and said, you're not marching through. And I think that's vitally important. I've got to sum up now, and I'll tell you why I think it's important. I think because there's a great racism being redeveloped. When you see UKIP, you say that Enoch Powell is all right. When you see UKIP say Enoch Powell was all right, that was the... And when Enoch Powell opened the gates of the rivers of blood, that was the generation that informed people like Paul Condon. Today we have another people being informed by, I think, another racist backlash against Bulgarians, Romanians, and actually I think it's important that we make sure that the police don't play that double role that they play of both being racist and being institutionally corrupt. I believe that we have to fight both of those things to make sure that we make a difference inside the future. I'll end up on this because I have to say, if you look at all the miscarriages of justice, a lot of them had to be changed. A lot of them had to be pushed back. Winston Silcott, they had to drop the charges against Winston Silcott. They haven't stopped actually. They've now found somebody who made a rap record, they say, who was from Tottenham, rap record, he's black, and he was from Tottenham, and he was around in '85, therefore he's guilty. So they haven't learned very much in terms of the way that they have.
He's on trial now.
He's on trial now, and he's on trial now. And I think that, so in that sense, they haven't learned very much. But in all the miscarriages of justice, one of the reasons why we've been successful is because they've had mass support from working class communities. And I think one thing that changed in the miners' strike was that you could get collective mass support from working class communities, and I think that's something that's one that we've always been able to use in order to make sure that people do get justice. People say it's important that we give them no peace so that we get justice, and I think that we have to carry on fighting as we have done before, because we have to expose the role of both the police and the state in terms of maintaining the status quo as it stands today.
Thanks very much, Weymann. Just one anecdote before I open it up. I remember going to the Lawrence inquiry one day, and the secretary who ran the inquiry was in a total state. And he's usually a very calm man. And I said, "What's happened?" He said, "The police tried to break into our offices last night and nick the draft report." And he said that to me just as a normal journalist, and it was well known that at one point the police were so scared about what was contained in the Macpherson report, they actually tried to break into the inquiry safe box, whatever it was, strong box, to get a sight of that report. So there you go. Okay.